Mr Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State's description of the road traffic changes there had me mesmerised. I could have listened to him all evening, but we thank him for that. It is a great pleasure to speak today on behalf of the official opposition. I'm not going to pretend that this bill has been entirely enjoyable, even smooth or stress-free, but we are where we are today, and it's definitely been worth getting to this place. And I think every member of this House and the other place should be incredibly proud of what has been achieved in such a short space of time. Some will say it doesn't go far enough, some will be disappointed that it does not contain what they wanted, but I think today marks a historic day in the devolution journey of our Scottish Parliament, because when this bill is passed, and there is no longer any doubt that it will be passed today, Scotland will have one of the most powerful devolved parliaments in the world. And that is what the Labour Party has always wanted in this process. It was the former Prime Minister, the former member for Kirkcaldy and Cowdenbeath, who devised a vow that promised more powers. And let's pay tribute to both him and, of course, the Daily Record newspaper for publishing it at the time. I knew I would get a reaction to that. If only I had said, Mr Deputy Speaker, the National, it may have been a slightly different response from behind me. But that paved the way for the Smith Commission, skillfully chaired by Lord Smith of Kelvin, who managed to negotiate cross-party agreement on the form those powers should take. That in turn laid the foundation for the bill that's before us today. It has now passed through this place and the other place. A revised fiscal framework has been agreed, and crucially with the Barnett formula at its heart. As promised, the vow delivered with Barnett protected. That was always a Labour Party priority, as we recognise the integral role played by the Barnett formula in maintaining public spending in Scotland. That said, and as the Institute for Fiscal Studies astutely observed during the fiscal framework negotiations, it was ironically the SNP government that insisted upon Barnett as being sacrosanct. With the zeal of the convert, they argued vociferously for an approach which, I quote, ensures the ongoing pooling and sharing of some proportion of devolved revenues across the United Kingdom, unquote. Of course, being long-standing advocates of the Barnett formula and the principle of pooling and sharing of the resources that it enshrines, we gave the Scottish Government our full backing in those negotiations. I wonder if that now means the SNP have renounced the #1 policy priority of full fiscal autonomy. Perhaps we'll hear. However, for the time being at least, we have an agreement. And the irony, Mr Deputy Speaker, of this Scotland Bill winging its way to Her Majesty, hopefully later today, to receive royal assent, on the eve of what would have been Separation Day in Scotland, the creation of one of the most powerful devolved parliaments in the world, as opposed to the white paper prospectus promised by the SNP in 2014. Mr Deputy Speaker, some of the Lord's amendments before us today speak directly to that agreement, delivering, for example, the strengthened borrowing powers and the enhanced fiscal oversight of Scotland's public finances that this fiscal framework provides for. So now that this impediment to the bill has been removed, we must focus on the powers the Scottish Parliament is receiving. And as the Secretary of State said, the legislative consent motion has been passed by the Scottish Parliament too. And given it's the last day of the Scottish Parliament today, it would be remiss not to pay tribute to all MSPs of all parties who have served in that Parliament since 2011. But if I may, Mr Deputy Speaker, with your indulgence, just say a word about those members, particularly Labour members, who are retiring from the Scottish Parliament today and have done so much in the process of getting this bill to us this afternoon. Since 1999, Hugh Henry, Duncan McNeill, Richard Simpson. We've had my old university friend Richard Baker, who was first elected in 2003, Margaret McDougall, Graham Pearson and Drew Smith, who were elected in 2011, all retire with our best wishes, but especially to Malcolm Chisholm, Mr Deputy Speaker, who was a long-standing member of this House as well. He retires, leaving with him a great distinction of public service to his constituents, and we wish him well. And it would be remiss of me not to mention the Right Honourable Member for Gordon, who isn't in his place. What is the Scottish Parliament's loss today, Mr Deputy Speaker, is this place's gain. Aren't we lucky indeed? But with the passing of this bill and the dissolution of the Scottish Parliament, we can lay the old arguments of the referendum to rest alongside any doubt, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the vow has not been delivered. The conversation must now move on to how these powers are used or not used in some cases. It's worth briefly reminding us what those powers are, as they are considerable, and the other place the Lords looked at these in great detail, and we thank them for that. The Scottish Parliament will have the power over rates and bands of tax on all non-savings and non-dividend income. That means it can put taxes up or bring them down. It can increase or reduce the thresholds at which the different rates are paid. Or it can choose to do nothing and keep things pretty much as they are, short of affording a tax break to higher earners. Champions of the status quo, perhaps, Mr Deputy Speaker, even if, in doing so, some people are abandoning a manifesto pledge to reduce the 50p tax, to reintroduce the 50p rate of tax for those earning over £150,000. That is what some have chosen to do, but that's not what we would do. And I wonder how commentators have looked at this particular process. Owen Jones, often quoted by the members beside me, called it a huge blow to their credentials, Mr Deputy Speaker. And what does the Scottish Trade Union Congress think of the current Scottish Government's grand plans for devolved taxation in Scotland that are in this bill? They said, and I quote, "a disappointingly timid approach to tax policy. Breaking the consensus on increasing the additional rate is difficult to fathom, an approach that is difficult to reconcile with the Scottish Government's so-called social and economic objectives." Mr Deputy Speaker, for the past 5 years, many people had the mantra, "more powers for Scotland." Today, with this bill as passed, we will have a powerful Scottish Parliament. Power not as a point of principle, but power to be used for positive, progressive change. For I can tell this House today in no uncertain terms that the Scottish Labour Party will not settle for power's sake. And we will not settle for the political choice of austerity, and this bill goes straight to the heart of how you would do that. We will oppose it in the UK, we will oppose that also in Scotland. And when we get into government, Mr Deputy Speaker, we will reverse it as well. We will build a better and a fairer Scotland for all, and taxation will not be our sole tool for doing so. Mr Deputy Speaker, Lord's Amendment 22 strengthens the borrowing powers available to the Scottish Government as agreed in the fiscal framework, allowing it to invest more in capital infrastructure or smooth out fluctuations in devolved taxes. In short, the Scottish Parliament will have the power to radically reshape, with those amendments and that power, the social and political landscape in Scotland. Because we all know, in order to have the excellent public services and high standards of living that some of those countries enjoy in other parts of the world, you must have the revenues to pay for them. And that means making bold decisions, Mr Speaker. Scottish Labour has already begun to set out how we would use these new powers coming to Scotland, along with those it already has, to maintain and increase levels of investment in education and indeed in our public services. A Scottish Labour government will depart from the discredited political doctrine of austerity and increase public spending over the lifetime of the next Scottish Parliament. We will be bold and we will be radical, because that is the only way you really change people's lives. We understand that having power is pointless if you are not prepared to use it. It's a shame that others, the Conservative Government and the SNP Scottish Government, will go into this election with a powerful Parliament offering a pale imitation of the status quo. After the blood, sweat and tears of getting this bill onto the statute book, I think that is unfortunate, because faced with the choice between using the powers of the Scottish Parliament to invest in an economy or carrying on with cuts to schools, we will use those powers. Over the course of this bill, Mr Speaker, I have focused, and this side of the House has focused, on securing practical, progressive changes to the legislation. Where we have felt it's fell short on the Smith Commission, we have sought to improve the bill. Where there has been disagreement, we have not declaimed noisily from the rafters. I have sought to reach compromise. In adopting this approach, we have won some valuable concessions from the Government, changes to this bill that will make a real practical difference to Scotland. In this place, we secured the power to create new benefits in devolved areas and elicited welcome clarity on the application and extent of the provisions to top up existing benefits. This This will allow the Scottish Parliament to effectively design a new social security system to suit the needs of Scotland. And looking at the budget from last week, Mr Speaker, thank goodness they have that power. In the other place, we campaigned successfully, as the Secretary of State has said, for an amendment to the bill that would devolve competence over pavement parking to the Scottish Parliament. And if you remember, it was the member for Rutherglen, I think, who mentioned that particular issue during the second reading debate in this place. The Lord's amendments to the bill mark the culmination of a lengthy process, which started with a private member's bill brought by the former member for Edinburgh North and Leith, Mark Lazarevich, several years ago. For those that think this is a minor measure, I would point them towards the many charities, most predominantly Living Streets and Guide Dogs UK, who have campaigned hard and long to secure it. I would thank them today for their unstinting efforts. Pavement parking is dangerous for pedestrians, especially people with sight loss, and also for parents with pushchairs, wheelchair users and other disabled people. By securing this amendment, we have cleared the way for the Scottish Parliament to take legislative measures to protect these people and increase the safety of our streets. In terms of the Government's other amendments in the Lords, they are merely technical and tidying up in nature, and of course we won't oppose any of them. Mr Speaker, I would like to close by thanking those people who have brought us to this juncture. The former Prime Minister deserves our thanks. It was his vow, which was in itself a product of his passion for Scotland, which paved the way for the process that created this bill. My right honourable friend, the member for Doncaster North, also deserves our thanks for pushing forward the vow and making sure that we secure these new powers for Scotland in the legislative programme. In this place, I'd like to thank the Secretary of State and his team, who have always been an affable adversary and has shown willingness to work constructively to improve this bill. And I think, in particular, the Secretary of State's staff deserve great credit for the way in which they've helped us navigate through this bill. I'd like to thank Labour's Shadow Scotland team, especially the honourable member for Caerphilly, who is not in his place today due to illness, who has been invaluable in his willingness to step into the breach, even when the debate was at its fiercest. I'd like to give special thanks to the clerks in the House of Commons Public Bill Office for their support, but more importantly their patience, and to the impartial experts in the House of Commons Library for all their help. In the other place, I'd like to thank my right honourable friend, the Lord McAvoy, for leading on this bill for the opposition in such an energetic manner, and also my right honourable friends Lord McFall and Lord Folkes of Cumnock for their learned advice and support. I'd like to give a mention to the Scottish Law Society, who have worked with on a number of amendments and who were always ready with an expert and impartial perspective. And, Mr Speaker, there's an interesting diversion today in the Scotland Bill that we haven't seen before, because Michael Clancy from the Scottish Law Society has sat under the gallery for every single session to deal with Scotland Bill since 1997 in both this place and the other place, but had to leave for his flight this evening and has been unable to watch these proceedings. All of those proceedings since 1997, and he's missed the very last, but we wish him well and all his particular advice. Well, it's certainly the last on this bill, and I'm sure everyone can agree with that. And finally, Mr Speaker, I'd like to thank Lord Smith of Kelvin and the commissioners of all parties who played an integral role in this process. Mr Speaker, it may not feel like it, but this is a historic day for Scotland that will fundamentally change the social and political landscape in Scotland. All we have to do now is make use of these substantial powers. We take up that challenge. It's now up to others to do the same.